Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books, coming to you on a Wednesday to do a tag in honor of Tag Tuesday. Today I want to respond to the book Postscript Tagged, originally put together by Adam at Memento Mori. Catherine at the lovely channel Taking Tea with Catherine was kind enough to tag me. I am rather late to this game, and somehow I have already released a lot of my memories of 2021. I mean, I remember the books if the titles or authors come up, but as I looked through these questions, I realized I was not immediately coming up with the answers. I've tried to think through these a bit now, so I hope I can keep the super long pauses to a minimum. So let's get to the prompts. The first one is to name the longest book you read this year, meaning last year, and the book that took you the longest to finish. As for longest, I think it was Trollope's The Way We Live Now, which I read during October. I pretty much speed read it because I was also reading George Eliot's Daniel Deronda at the same time. While Daniel Deronda is a bit shorter, still quite long, but not quite as long as Trollope, I spent significantly more time with it, partly because I was fairly obsessed by how Eliot was choosing to structure her book and how she was exploring questions of special interest to me. As for the book that took me the longest to finish, I suppose I should list the phenomenal nonfiction work Square Haunting by Francesca Wade. Essentially, this is a study of 5 women who all lived at various times in the same neighborhood: Virginia Woolf, mystery writer Dorothy Sayers, the poet H.D., classicist Jane Harrison, and economic historian Eileen Powers. This book is a phenomenal feat, really intricately thought out. When I first started reading, I wasn't sure the conceit for why these authors belonged in one book. That is, that they all lived in one particular square in London, albeit at different times, would actually add anything. But it absolutely works. Read this book if you haven't yet. Still, it's absolutely ludicrous that it took me so long. Even before its initial publication in England, I had the opportunity to read one of the chapters, which left me itching to get to the whole book. But I didn't actually do it. Fairly early in 2020, I considered buying a British copy, but due to some other commitments, I decided to wait until it was released in the US later that year. And I didn't actually pick up the whole book until late in 2021, when I had the great pleasure of reading this amazing book with Brian of Bookish, as well as 2 wonderful BookTube commenters, Noelle and Stephanie Cohen. Prompt number 2 asks us to name a book you read in 2021 that was outside of your comfort zone. Well, I think I'll name a book I read in 2021 as an advanced reader's copy, but which was actually just published at the beginning of 2022. I've said before that I tend not to like thrillers. They're just not my thing. In general, I don't want authors to leave me stressed out about fictional stuff that I know is going to be fully resolved in the end. I've only read a handful of these books, but all of them were supposed to be exciting, but I found totally predictable. But the one I just read is a bit of a different story. That is Mark Prynne's brand new The Latinist. I'm including it here because it is a thriller, but it is also literary fiction in many ways and a great intellectual pleasure as well. My review of it came out in the Washington Independent Review of Books yesterday or the day before, and I'll leave a link to that down in the show notes. Essentially, this is the story of a classics grad student just going on the academic job market who is struggling with her Oxford advisor. The discussion of the abuse of power in student-teacher relationships is interesting, but by far my favorite parts are when Prynne talks about Tessa, the grad student, and her academic work. The author goes so far as to actually create ancient Latin poetry, as well as English translations of it, including commentary on an unusual meter, etc. One of the things I find most fascinating, which I'm going to skirt around very subtly so I won't spoil anything, is how the author more or less embodies literary conceits. For example, he mirrors particular poetic choices with particular experiences of disability. Prynne calls this the prosody of the human form. At any rate, while the thriller part of the book, actually the part I very much liked least, was outside my comfort zone, the nerdy bits were right up my alley. Prompt number 3 asks how many books we've reread this past year. I have no idea, actually. I suppose I really need to start keeping records of what I read and when, so I can answer questions like this a bit better. There was one book I reread twice, Paul Kalanithe's When Breath Becomes Air, a memoir written by a neurosurgeon about his experience with stage 4 lung cancer. It's a book I loved when I read it the first time, soon after I had finished chemotherapy for breast cancer in 2017. I read it again a year later when I was looking at illness and death and grief from a different perspective. And I read it twice this winter as I thought about how Kalanithe was constructing his memoir. For such a short book, it is extremely powerful. I was drawn into his story of trying to make sense of how his terminal diagnosis changed and didn't change his work life and his family life. But I was also quite interested in his writing about his perspectives on the practice of medicine. As a non-medical person who knows much more about primary care medicine and public health, mostly because of my spouse's employment, I tend to think along a very different track. Anyway, I definitely recommend When Breath Becomes Air, perhaps especially the very beautiful epilogue written by the author's wife, Lucy Kalanithi. Although I love When Breath Becomes Air, it didn't actually make it to the top of my favorite rereads list, which is what the next prompt asks us to name. That honor goes to Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, a book I don't think I had read in 20 years or more. One should never wait that long between Austen rereads. The BookTube celebration of Jane Austen July will, I think, keep me from doing that again. But in many ways, the long lag between rereadings prepared me to approach it in an almost completely fresh way. Oh, actually, I realize now that I am wrong. The top of my favorite rereads should probably be Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I first read Mrs. Dalloway, embarrassingly, in 2020. In 2021, I read it again because I was reviewing the marvelous new annotated version of the novel put out by Merve Imre so I could review it in print. While the novel was a reread, my understanding and appreciation of the book was expanded because of all of the new information I got because of Imre's brilliant annotations. Should I count it as a reread or not? The next prompt is really interesting. Name a book you read for the first time that you look forward to rereading in the future. What a great question. I think I want to reread George Eliot's Daniel Deronda, although I want to read Middlemarch again before I get to it. And both of them are pretty big commitments, so it might take a while before I actually pick both of them up. Prompt number 6 is to name a favorite single short story or novella that you read this year. While I always love to read separately published novellas and short stories, here I want to list 2 collections which both came out in 2021, I think, which each started out with a set of short stories and ended with a novella. One is My Monticello by Joycelyn Nicole Johnson. I was quite disappointed by most of the short stories that start the book. One, Control Negro, was quite interesting and reminded me in some ways of Ralph Ellison's work. Recently, I listened to an audio of it read by LeVar Burton, which is incredible. The other stories fell relatively flat for me. The novella, on the other hand, has really stuck with me. It's a story about a racially diverse group of neighbors and friends who, fleeing a race riot in Charlottesville, Virginia, take refuge at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. The central character in the novella is a descendant of the former president and Sally Hemings, a woman he held in slavery and who bore him 6 children. In other words, the refugees fleeing from violent white supremacists establish a settlement in the home their ancestors were forced to build. While I definitely recommend the novella, what I'm really looking forward to is Johnson's next work, especially if it is a longer and deeper exploration of a story. She's a writer with a great deal of potential. The second collection was Danielle Evans' The Office of Historical Corrections. Many of the stories, most of which deal with the impacts of racism and sexism, have friendships between women, sometimes quite complicated friendships, and deal with questions that so-called cancel culture raises. I found almost all the stories to be both emotionally powerful and intellectually thought-provoking, and I especially love the novella about a government agency which hires academically trained historians to correct historical mistakes on everything from monuments and other memorials to trinkets at touristy shops. Early in the novella, the main character even corrects a card at her local bakery, a card designed to sell cupcakes, but which in the process incorrectly suggested that Juneteenth is a commemoration of the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. Evans' whole book, stories and novellas, are full of examples of this kind of funny but sharp and also wise prose. I highly recommend it. The seventh prompt in this tag asks us to list a book we liked and would recommend to a wide variety of readers. I'm going to choose a book I read this year that was a total surprise for me. I knew almost nothing about it going in and wasn't expecting something so lovely. That book is Every Day the River Changes by Jordan Salama. It's a short little thing recounting a young man's month-long journey along the path of the Central River in the country of Colombia. As he travels, occasionally on water, but usually along the shore, he meets a variety of people with fascinating backgrounds and stories to tell. I will link to my review below. I can imagine that this piece of travel writing would appeal to people of all sorts of backgrounds and ages and interests. I suppose the major gift-giving season is now over, but this book would, I think, be an appropriate choice for a lot of folks. The flip of question, number 7, is about specialized appeal. A book you liked but would be hesitant to recommend to just anyone. In the last couple of weeks, I've read 3 books that I will probably talk about next week, which I thought I would never be able to recommend to anyone. After reading them, I now think that 2 of the 3 would actually be quite wonderful for the majority of readers. Well, the majority of readers who were types that would ever be listening to my recommendations, at least. But like I said, they appeared in my life in 2022, and I'll be talking about them sometime soon. This is one of those questions I'm blanking on a bit for 2021. Well, how about this one? A book that I think is terrific, but I can very much foresee why some readers would think it was strange. Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses is to me an absolutely brilliant collection of interrelated essays. The jumping off point for the book is the fact that George Orwell, writer of 1984, was a gardener. And jump off from there is exactly what Solnit does. The essays go in all sorts of disparate directions, exploring themes that I would have assumed would have been hard to unify in any way. For my taste, it not only works here, but works perfectly. But I can imagine that some readers would feel that the subjects just range all over the place and have no business in a book about George Orwell or whatever. I'm sure you know whether you're the kind of reader who enjoys this sort of thing. I'm tempted to say that those of you who are more plot-driven might be the ones who wouldn't like it. But that could be totally wrong. Have any of you read it yet? The final substantive prompt: reflect on your year as a bookish content creator. Goals met, good bad memories, favorite videos you made, etc. Well, I continue to love my time on BookTube, although I've definitely had quite a hard time fitting it into a comfortable place in my schedule, especially over the last month or so, but really for a lot of the end of 2021. I would like to remedy that going forward, at least starting on February 1st. I really don't have goals for numbers of subscribers or anything, but I did realize yesterday, as I started thinking about this tag, that I've just reached 2,000 subscribers, which, while not a goal, does feel a little amazing. My favorite BookTube memory? Definitely the 2 visits I was able to make this year up to Boston, where I got to not only go to the Brattle Bookshop, but meet Steve Donahue and Frida Bean, have wine and calzones with them, and even film videos. What fun. As for my own favorite videos, I am proud of myself for sticking my neck out more than usual on a video about the big biography of Philip Roth. I loved the conversation that Sean the Bookmaniac put together about one of my academic books. And while I was at first embarrassed by how kind everyone was in the discussion of it, I now find it not embarrassing but enormously confidence boosting. Another video I'm pretty proud of is my reading of Flannery O'Connor's wonderful story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. One silly one I had a great time making was a video where I showed how I wrapped my scarves around my head. And I really enjoyed the Bookish Superhero tag too. I'll try to link all of those down below. And now to the final prompt, number 10. Tag some fellow bookish content creators. Part of me just wants to pass on tagging people since I am so late answering these prompts, but I'm going to do it anyway. I tag Brian at Bookish and Roz at Scally-Daddling About the Books, although I am so behind on BookTube that they may have already done the tag, and if not, they may not want to review the past year when we are already well into 2022. Please feel no pressure from me to respond. Well, that will do it for today. Thank you all for joining me here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.